All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt. I am your speaker tonight. I'm calling into you from San Francisco right now. And as Jason said, I spent about 5 months out at Fly, so I missed a lot of the things that everyone has gone through. I had my own version of loneliness, but I think I've realized that it feels very different in the city. So I've been back for a few weeks now to SF after having lived pretty much solo in the desert for 5 months. And, I have lots of empathy and sympathy for what everyone's been going through. So I am happy to get to talk with you all tonight and, appreciate you all taking time. I'm sure that you're all on lots of Zoom calls. So being on a social Zoom call, I have found those challenging to participate in and haven't really welcomed them into my life or evenings. So I appreciate all of you joining and calling in. My role at Burning Man, I'll give you a little background. So I'm the director of Fly Ranch, which is Burning Man's 3,800 acre ranch in Nevada that is about 10 or 15 miles away from where Black Rock City, Burning Man's main event, happens. I don't know if any of you have been to that gathering. It is a novel undertaking and a lot of stuff happens there. So I will just kind of jump into this presentation that I was going to give and give you some background on Fly and how Burning Man came to start stewarding it. And if folks want to put things into the chat along the way, I'll try and keep an eye. And then I've asked if the hosts see something that they want me to talk about to interrupt me, because I'll kind of be talking. So I'm gonna share my screen and all right. Fly Ranch overview. So today I'm going to tell you about some of the infrastructure that we have at Fly, and then give you a little overview of what we did in 2019, and then talk about some of the ecology of the project and the property itself, talk about some of the ways that we're working on a minimum viable property. I have taken that from tech and still get to use the MVP phrasing. And then I'm going to talk about how all of this plays into sustainability for Fly, and then for overall for Burning Man as a whole, and where we see our role in that. So the first thing, for some context on Fly and how it came to be, is Burning Man has happened at the same, Burning Man started on Baker Beach in the 80s and then migrated out to land that's public land that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management in the 90s, and has been happening in the Black Rock Desert on an alkaline salt flat since the 90s. And then in 1997, the only time that Burning Man didn't happen where it's always happened was it happened at Fly Ranch, because they lost their federal permit that year. And so they had a 10,000 person event at Fly Ranch. And since then, really, people wondered what would happen if you invited burners to make a space all year where they could do something. And so this is kind of the framing that Chip Conley gave. Chip is a founder of Joy to Vie and used to work at Airbnb and was one of the leading donors and thought members and one of the original board members for Burning Man Project when we became a nonprofit. And so Chip really played a large role in the thinking and framing of this. And so this is kind of at a simple level how you could think about it. It's much more a question than an answer of what Fly is. And just like with Burning Man, which kind of unfolded over many, many years, Fly also, I think, will unfold over many, many years for what it will eventually become. This is a picture of Chip. So one of the key features that people really like about Fly is there are hot springs, and they usually run around 105 degrees. And so, or the main one does. So there's actually 150 hot and cold springs at Fly Ranch that are really beautiful, and they are fed from different underground sources. Some of them are 160s, some of them are cold water, but they're really beautiful to swim in. And you can coat yourself in this mud. I don't like it on my skin, but some people really like putting it on their skin. And so one of the perks of my time in the desert for the past 5 months was I communed with the water a good deal and enjoyed the hot springs. And it's a really nice feature of the property. And it's very surprising that we have as much water as we do, because we're in the desert, obviously. And so the neighboring areas around us are empty playa, but where we are is covered with plants and water. And so just to give you a sense of how much water there is, every year we dump 18 million gallons of water onto the streets of Black Rock City to keep the dust down. And that lowers the water level in one of our 3 reservoirs by about 1.5 feet. So we could easily have somewhere between 100 and 200 million gallons of surface water at Fly. It's an incredible amount of water. And I got interested in that because I worked at water.org before this and became interested in / concerned about our global approach to water management. So the very first thing you have to do when you're going to an empty property is figure out how to use the bathroom. And so we have been experimenting with these toilets that are called ecozoics. They're advanced biofiltration toilets. And you put different types of soil and enzymes and microbes into the tank. And so when people use the bathroom, it actually dries out everything that's in there. And so these are the toilets that we've been using, and they compress what you have down to something that can eventually be spreadable as compost. And one thing to note about urine is that urine has a really high phosphate level in it, and it's the only naturally occurring source of phosphate besides mined phosphate. And phosphate's is the key component in most fertilizers for agriculture. And so only a couple countries really control all of the phosphate in the world. And it's something to be concerned about because we might run out of phosphate globally in about 20 years. So some hippie farmers in Vermont actually water their fields directly with urine. And it's something that we've been talking about because it's actually a really good soil additive. When we first went out to the property, many parts of it looked like this. So Fly, there have been people in the area, the Numu, the Northern Paiute, which I'll talk about in a little, have been out in that area for around 11,000 years, but more locally at Fly, starting in the mid 18th century or 19th century, there were people there doing all kinds of things, but primarily grazing and agriculture, and then drilling for water. And so everyone who was there before us left a lot of trash behind. So our first year in 2017 and part of 2018 was really about digging up trash. So we had lots of dumps basically that were like this all over the property that we excavated and found all kinds of interesting cultural relics from past eras that people had left behind. The first thing that we built on the property was this bridge. And we, over the course of the past 3 years, have had about 300 public nature walks where people come from all over the world. One guy came from China and bought 9 tickets and brought his family over for his birthday. We've had people from all over the place who come in. They want to see the geyser, they want to see the land. And so we have guided nature walks 4 times a week. And we used to walk over this creek bed here. And I got a lot of feedback about that because we just had a board on it. And people did not like that. So, the most sustainable way to build something is to reuse materials. And so we made this bridge as our first project with a group called Burners Without Borders. That's a subsidiary / part of Burning Man that works in community resilience and disaster relief and ecological projects. And they came out and built that bridge all from materials that were found on the property. And so now thousands of people have walked across that bridge. And so that was our first real piece of infrastructure we put onto the property. Then we started putting out art. So this is a piece called The Pier. This is by Matt Schultz and the Pier crew that are based out of Reno. And so it's just basically a huge dock. And so it's been out on the playa at Burning Man 3 years. And so they put it in at Fly. And so now people on the nature walks come out and see it. And it's really cool because it blends in really well with the landscape. And I sometimes have enjoyed kidding with people because people will say, why did the past owners put a dock here? And then I make up a story about how this used to be an area where people smuggled things, and this was where bootleggers would shore up their boats, and it's a whole fun thing. You have to make your own fun when you're in the desert, so that's one of my methods. We also have an old piece called The Bone Tree that Dana Albany made. That's a bunch of old cow bones that we have at Fly now. We have the Narwhal, which is a art car that's at Burning Man a lot of years that a guy named Pepe made that used to have operas on it. That's a pirate ship that looks like a narwhal, and kids love this thing. It is the most fun for kids. and you can climb up into it, and it's the highest point on the property where you can really see the whole range of what's there. Then this was our art piece that we put in last year. This is called Baba Yaga. So for those of you who've seen John Wick, you may be familiar with that phrase. But this is a 3-story, once you're inside of it, it's a 3-story building that's like a witch's house. And it has over 500 different objects, like feathers and stones and all these different things. And so, that's about a story and a half, 10, 15 feet off the ground there that you walk up into, and then there's a little crow's nest inside of it. And so we put that piece in last year. Then this is what it looks like at night when it lights up. So it looks pretty creepy. It's really cool. And then we use stretch canvas tents for when we're having people out there. So we have, you have to have shade out there. The sun is brutal. It's incredibly hot. I'm Swedish, and I get sunburned extremely easily. So I can do about 10 minutes outside. So we use stretch canvas tents, but the desert corrodes everything really quickly. Everything breaks, everything gets dried out, everything snaps. And so these don't last more than 7 or 8 months when they're out there. This is another one of the bathroom units that we have that's a more traditional approach to managing waste that was built on top of a trailer, so it's actually portable. I've already shown you that picture. This is a fire pit that we have that we use for gatherings, and so we have 2 of these on the property. And we bring in wood from one of Burning Man's neighboring ranches. The Burning Man Work Ranch is right beside us, which is a 200-acre work ranch that has makers and builders, and it's really the backbone of what we do for Black Rock City when we build the city. And everyone who works there is incredibly good at everything that's physical and manual and putting things together and fixing things. And so everything we do is possible because of them. And then this is one of our solar units that we used last year. So we actually have a couple different solar arrays out there now. We have 2 solar trailers that are entirely self-contained units. They are the many people who have looked at them feel like they're the best solar trailers they've ever seen. They have batteries on them. They have racks, transistors, inverters, everything. And so you can just drive them around. They're on an old flatbed trailer. And so this was that same kind of model. And then inside of it, you can see we have a 5K battery that's called a volt stack. And that's a portable battery pack that we're able to use to drive around the property and power things. So we actually haven't used generators out there since mid-2018 because we've done everything entirely on solar, including 99-person events with machinery getting charged, kitchens getting run, everything. So power is an incredibly difficult part of what we're doing because we're 20 miles from the nearest power or water or septic. And so everything we do is totally off grid. We have these bunkhouses that we've been able to use. So these have memory foam mattresses inside of them and can sleep 6 people. And so they're converted shipping containers that are 20-foot containers that can roll off and on flatbed trailers. And so people actually can stay inside of these, and they've been, as you can see, they've been modified to have doors. They have AC units in them. They're hooked up for power. They can run solar. So they're really spectacular. And these came from a theme camp called Playa Alchemist that's on Playa that let us use these, and another one called Camp Epic. And so they've been really helpful. This is the crown jewel of the Fly Ranch infrastructure, in my opinion. Many people have different opinions about that, but this is a Russian steam banya that 10 people can lie down in it, and we have an oven in it that makes it really hot. And so you can lie down and get traditional Russian steam treatments. We have a couple of friends from a theme camp at Burning Man called Steamology, and they built that there. And it's an incredible experience. You can go in for an hour, and for them, it's really kind of a sacred undertaking to work with steam. And so they do transformative work in there. I've really loved it. And then right beside it, you can see there's a steel cauldron. That's a wood-fired hot tub. So we put wood underneath it and fill it up with water, and it works as a hot tub. And then behind it, that coffin-shaped thing is a cold plunge that gets down to 33 degrees. And so you can kind of do a little mini, healing retreat out there with that. And then we put out fire pits and stuff like that. So this is kind of the healing part of what we've talked about for gatherings at Fly. 2019. So this was when the property was purchased. This was the plan in 2015 that the team that worked on that acquisition, which is a guy named Daniel Clausen, a guy named Bear Kate, someone named James Milner, and a woman named Katiana Kate. And they're the 4 people who led the acquisition. And they pulled off a miracle. And what they did was really impressive, and I'm happy to talk about that more later. But this was their initial plan for what 2020 might look like. Obviously, 2020, there was no world where it was going to look like this. So I will show you what 2019 looked like, which was almost about what they had projected. So we had last year in 2019, we actually had 21 campouts with between 10 and 99 people. So basically every other weekend in season from March through October when it's warm enough. And then we had geyser guardians out there who were kind of like rangers for the property who come out there and stay out there. And then we had nature walks 4 times a week that had 30 people a walk. And so that was our programmatic approach last year, and we were planning on scaling it more this year, but that's obviously been scaled back. But we're actually going to be starting up nature walks again next week and doing distance walks. And I've been figuring out and looking into how testing and safety protocols and all of that could work for being able to do increased programming next year, because we have 3,800 acres. It's a 5.9 square mile property, so there's plenty of space. One of the weekends we had was a spring break field trip. So science has been very crucial for us, working with scientists. And in the background there, you can see Fly Geyser. That's a geyser that is the result of a well that was drilled in 1964, and they didn't cap the well. And so the various minerals that come up have formed into a geyser that's going 24 hours a day. And so it's always spewing. And it has this really interesting formation, and it's about 30 or 40 feet. It runs off and forms the water reservoirs and the hot springs that we have. And so scientists love to come out and study that, and generally to just study the ecosystem. So the University of Nevada, Reno ran a field trip out there and had an alternative spring break trip that they did a bunch of studies in. Then we've had other groups. I'm not going to show this video now, but I'll share this slide deck later. But we've had other groups that come out to do viewings of the property, a film crew that came out. We had a education summit, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, so STEAM. And that was a small academic conference of about 30 or 40 professors from around 15 different disciplines that was led by the Desert Research Institute. And they did water sampling and soil sampling. And it was one of the most overwhelming weekends we've had for me personally, because usually I don't get that many questions I don't know the answer to. At Fly, that weekend, I got so many questions. I had no idea what people were talking about because they all were academics. But having those kinds of discussions about the ecology is really cool for us. And they actually found a previously undiscovered type of cyanobacteria that I'll talk about in a little bit. Burners Without Borders did a sustainability summit there and set of eco sprints. There was a STEAM training for our Banya, a leadership retreat for training volunteers at Burning Man, a Leave No Trace training for people to learn about Leave No Trace practices. And then we've put in various infrastructure like shade, and then we had a geology camp out as well. This is from a volunteer weekend that we had. Also an art project called Offals Gas did a piece at Burning Man. And part of what their project was about imagining what a better approach to ecology could look like. And part of that is considering our relationship to land stewardship and the history of land appropriation. Colonialism didn't really come to Nevada until later. The Numu tribes there, the Northern Paiute tribes, they didn't make first contact with settlers or settler colonialism until really the mid-1800s. And within the area that we're in, there's 4 Numu bands that have direct relationships to that area, including the Ku'uitakuta, the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, which is nearby to us and on the way in. And so they have this beautiful museum on the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribes Reservation. And so one of the projects that we did was doing an ecological restoration project at their museum and working with them and learning from them. And then we also, last year at Burning Man, this is my favorite thing I've done in my job. We did this thing where we have this old bus that you can see here, that's a school bus, and it has a stripper pole in it and a sound system, and all the seats are torn out. And we drove around at Burning Man and drove up to people who seemed like they were wandering around aimlessly and would say, "Do you want to go on a magical adventure?" And most people would say no. And then, or they'd say, "Where are you going?" And we would say, "We can't tell you, but we promise you won't regret it." And then when the first person would get on, we would then say, "Go get that person." And then they would get off and say, "Do you want to go on a magical adventure?" And then we would have 15 people and we would take them out of Burning Man and drive them the 12 miles to Fly Ranch and give them towels and drinks and snacks and let them go in the hot springs. And then we'd bring them back over to Burning Man. And it was so fun. And one of the principles of Burning Man is gifting. And this was and radical inclusion. And so our effort here was to do something that really was fun and that spoke to the spirit of what Burning Man's really about. And it's a spectacular way to introduce people to the property. They lose their minds. We also did a retreat last year that a woman named Yodessa Williams hosted. And she's an author and an activist. And she had the idea that she wanted to do a writing retreat for women and non-binary writers of color. So she did a writing retreat last year for 34 women. And as part of their trip, they went on a field trip. And this is a picture of Billie Jean Guerrero, who's the executive director of the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe Visitor Center and Museum, giving a talk for them. And they felt it was really important to go out and to learn about the history of the land. And these are some quotes from the women who were at that retreat and some of the experiences that they had. But one of the things that we want to think about for this is, how can Fly be an inclusive space for everyone? Burning Man is, like many things, is a predominantly white institution. And so considering how we can play a role in supporting communities that need support, need resources, want safe spaces has been something that's really important to us. And working with Yoda was incredible. And she brought a perspective on feminine leadership. That's something we've really talked about, of how we can work in that way. We had another weekend where this was a coffee setup that I really liked that I put in here. It's hard to get coffee out there. So whenever people bring real coffee and make it for me, I feel very excited about it. We also, in addition to living near the tribe, we live near a city called Gerlach that has about 120 residents. And they live out there year round, and they get an influx of people who come in for Burning Man, where 70,000 people, or really 80,000 people, drive through this one-lane road in a 25-mile-an-hour city that's normally empty most of the year. And they deal with a lot from us. And there's people driving through there who are lost or trying to get tickets, and it's just an incredible amount of traffic. And we've really wanted to work with locals because they know how the land works. They live out there. They're our friends. They're our neighbors. And so Bruno's is the main restaurant there in town. And so one of the first things that we did when we realized that our biggest project that we wanted to do was a design challenge was we had our introductory meeting was a lunch at Bruno's to work with locals to hear their perspective on what kind of design challenge they thought we should put together. And this is the map for that. And the project that we're doing is a collaboration with a group called the Land Art Generator Initiative. And they've done design challenges all over the world focused on building beautiful infrastructure that also contributes to sustainability. And so they want to make artistic infrastructure that's regenerative. And so we're running a design challenge now that is going to close next month, where we're soliciting applications from all over the world for people to have ideas around food, power, shelter, water, and waste management. We have a panel of judges and technical experts. We've raised some seed funding for it, and we will select 10 or 15 of those projects and have a build next year from March through October, where we actually build infrastructure on the property that we hope will be novel, that will be supportive of gatherings there, that will be open source. And this is really how we want to work with the community and work with anyone who wants to be involved, is how can we be a platform for people to experiment and to test out ideas that would never get R&D support otherwise that could come out there. And so that's our big project that we're working on now. And this is the design site. So this overall is a map of Fly. And so it's a big long rectangle. So it's about 4 miles long and a mile or a mile and a half wide at any given moment. And so the green areas are areas where we would build basically anything. The yellow areas are areas where we might build some things. And then the red areas are things where we wouldn't really build. And so in the middle there, where there's a lot of red, that's where the wetlands are. So we have about 600 acres of swamp and marsh and wetlands that has standing water in it. And so we're not going to build anything there, but other parts of the property, especially that green area that's in the middle, that area used to be an alfalfa farm. And so that area has been highly distressed before. And then the rest of the property has somewhere around 150 plant species that we've identified, and then 90 types of migratory birds, a bunch of animals. And so we're just kind of opening up the property, and that's basically how we've done everything this whole time, is my background was in open source software before this, working at Plotly, and that was really when I came to believe in open source as a way to work with people. When people come to me and say, Matt, you know what you should do at Fly, or come to my teammates, the other people on the Fly team. Zach Saravello is the operations manager who has a background in growing and all kinds of farming and ecological projects and festivals, and then Joe Childs, who's our land steward out there, and then Lisa Lisa Beers, who is our land steward out there. All of us, between the four of us, there's no way we can build all this kind of stuff that we want to do or have these events, and they're great, and we all love what we're doing, but we've all kind of tried to take the approach of inviting other people to imagine what they want to have there and then trying to support them. And that's kind of how I came to love open source. Was when someone would come to us at Plotly, we would say, that's a great idea, want to submit a pull request? And that's kind of the mentality that I've tried to take to this too, is when people say they want to do something, I say, great, how can I help you? We also had a walk with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe that we organized with them, that the Nevada Indian Commission helped us out with. And then now I'll talk about some ecology. First, are there any questions, Jason, that I should, or other organizers that I should tend to? I'm guessing you're muted and unable to mute yourself.
Yeah, no questions look like they've come in, just introductions of different people.
Cool. All right, I'll press on. So there's no way I could summarize all of the ecology for you in one swoop here, so I'm just going to give you a few highlights. So the first is the cyanobacteria that I mentioned earlier. So lots of, there's this whole discussion about where life evolved from, right? And so one of these pieces of it that's interesting is this notion of the kind of dark, unknown, unmapped things that are in water that's deep underground in different geological and hydrothermal systems. And so we have water that's coming up from very deep in an aquifer that's underneath Fly Ranch. And this is one of the types of organisms that some researchers found. This is a mapping of it that they found that had been previously undiscovered before. And that's in the hot springs. And the hot springs have all kinds of interesting things in them, including a minnow that has the highest known temperature tolerance. It can live in temperatures up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. There's snails. We have these protozoan microbial algae mats that some biologists think are where single cell organisms split into multi-cell organisms, where it's the sludge of life. And so the pools are their own fascinating ecological system there. We also graze cows there, and so we have 150 cows that are out there, and this is useful for a number of reasons. One is we are zoned as a general rural and a high desert area property. And for those of you who ever touched zoning before, good for you. Zoning is unbelievably complex, and it's been really hard for me to figure out, but we have good people who help us out with that. But we graze cows there in part because it helps us fill our tax designation as an agricultural center. In Nevada, you can get a big tax break if you are an ag site, or if you're an open space, or if you're a golf course. So I have a long planned idea to run, and I'll tell you all this here. I want to run an April Fool's prank where we say we're going to take advantage of the golf, and we have water hazards already. So it's a whole plan that I hope to hatch one day. But so we have 150 cows out there, and so they graze out there. And our friend Willie Courtney, who is kind of if there were a mayor there, he would be the mayor in Gerlach. He grazes his cows there. So they walk all over the property, and they're there for about 6 to 8 months. And they also help us maintain our water rights, because we own surface and groundwater rights. And in order to maintain your water rights, you have to use the water. And so the cows graze, and that's one way we get it. We also have wild horses on the property that many people love, and they are beautiful creatures, and they can be very ecologically destructive. So this is a horse that was walking up to. So there's probably about 16 to 20 horses that are on the property. And overall, the West has a huge problem with wild horses. There's anywhere between, depending on whose estimate you listen to, 80 to 100,000 wild horses in the West. And the upper bound of how much the ecology can handle is probably only about 12,000. So for those of you who spent time more inland in the West, wild horses are a very controversial topic between ranchers and conservationists and policy people. So it's an interesting debate for us. We're just going to keep the ones that we have there now and live with that. Invasive species, also another fascinating ecological problem. So invasive species management is a 10 to 20 year timeline. That's the kind of thing we plan in terms of. So here you can see the percentage of invasive species in different parts of the property. So you'll notice that some parts of the property are entirely red, which means that they've already been entirely taken over by an invasive species. We have 18 different types of invasive species on the property. And so some of them have entirely taken over areas of the property. For example, the red dots in the middle, that's an area that's entirely covered with something called cheatgrass. And so cheatgrass grows basically wherever it's extremely fast growing. And so when wildfires happen, it tends to follow right behind them. And so when they used to farm there, when they did alfalfa, when they stopped farming, they didn't replant anything. And so cheatgrass came in right behind it. And cheatgrass is very concerning because it dies in around June every year, and then it becomes a huge wildfire hazard until it starts regrowing again. And so one of the ways to manage it, and how we've tried to think about invasive species in general, is to deepen our relationship to the plant. You know, the plants are living beings that are there, and they got there somehow, and understanding how they got there is an important way to consider how we should relate to them. Many invasive species in the US came in through colonialism. They were seed additives that were put in with grain and came in. They came in as part of the triangle trade and as part of the slave trade. And so many of the plants that we have as invasives around the country here came in some way or another as a result of colonialism and land appropriation. And so when we think about plants that are invasive, you know, dumping chemicals on them, while potentially convenient, also kind of continues that cycle of not respecting land and not seeing land as sacred and not seeing living beings as an extension of us. And so we're very lucky to have Lisa Skirpis, our land fellow, who has a PhD in wetlands ecology, who mapped all of these different invasive species here. And then we've talked about ways to interact with them. So for example, for cheatgrass, you can actually fence cows in on them from March through May during the window when cheatgrass is green, and you can either fence them in or you can collar them together so they graze like a herd, and they will eat the cheatgrass during that time and then fertilize the ground behind them, and then you can come in behind once they've grazed it and then plant a competing perennial like crested wheatgrass or something like that, or another native species. And so thinking in systems is how we want to approach this, especially for invasive species management. We also have, besides sheepgrass, Russian olives, tamarisk. The most concerning invasive species we probably have is Russian knapweed, which goats will graze on. So we've talked to a guy who has 600 goats, and this is what he does. He brings his goats around to different properties to eat what's going on there. So that is all kind of a precursor to this. So when Burning Man bought the property, as I said, the idea was about letting there be an evolving experiment to see what could come from it. And there are over 500 people really who were involved with different parts of the visioning project for considering what fly could be and thinking about that in the long term. And so many people have different ideas about how that could look, but really we've just wanted to scale across different areas for what a minimum viable version of this project could look like. So in the past year, we had different ways that we made revenue from different projects. We had different site features that we put in for being able to sustainably host people on the property. We focused on things that were inherent to Burning Man, like art and healing and land stewardship. Having our design challenge to invite the community to come in. Everything that we've done has come through volunteerism. We have an incredible number of volunteers who really run all of the projects that we have out there. We have a great volunteer coordinator named Erica Wisnowski, who's handled that. We have geyser guardians, we have walks, and then we've had gatherings of all different types on the property. And so we're really kind of in the initial phase here where I think we can just kind of start to say last year we had gotten to a minimum viable property standpoint after a couple of years of experimentation. And then sustainability. So Burning Man in July of 2019 published a 10-year sustainability roadmap with 3 core goals to it that were outlined over a 10-year roadmap for how we wanted to be and where we wanted to be as both a nonprofit, where Burning Man Project is the nonprofit that oversees a lot of our programming. And then we have properties. We have a dozen or so other properties in Nevada besides the one that we've been talking about the most, which we have a 360-acre parcel on the edge of town in Gerlach. We have we have offices, so all of these things. And then we have events, obviously. And so we've talked about that we want to be able to say that we're regenerative, where it's better for the ecology of Earth for Burning Man to exist than to non-exist, where we are globally leaving no trace and have eliminated our contributions to landfills and have closed the waste loop. And that is encompassing then also of things like composting and gray water management, black water management, et cetera, and then be carbon negative. So we want to be drawing down more emissions than we are putting up. And those are ambitious goals, but we really tried to simplify it to something that we felt like would be something that others could work with us in, that we would be able to orient around instead of having some complex, multifaceted layer of things. And so the data science piece and part of this, and why I really thought this group was interesting, is a lot of this is not things that people are measuring right now. No one really has a criteria for how to be able to say with a straight face that you're regenerative, because there's so many considerations. And I think that within the framework of capitalism, it's very difficult to be a conscious consumer or to really take care of your waste streams or anything like that. So what we're talking about here are fundamental shifts in how we interact with one another and how we consume things. And so we've been trying to come up with ways to measure these, to start talking about how we might actually measure the landfill contributions that we're making and how we can measure our regenerative impact, tree plantings, restoration projects, that kind of thing. And then the carbon negative piece of it, that's kind of the part where Fly is useful to consider, because we could consider building our own carbon capture and storage methods there. And so this is from a paper. Carbon capture, obviously incredibly complex and very emerging field, where most of these methods for carbon capture have really come out in the past 4 to 6 years. Before that, it seemed like, well, there might be no way to address the carbon issue, where we're something like 420 parts per million right now and of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that realistically needs to be below 350. And so different people have different projections, but roughly speaking, all of these will need to be scaled to unimaginably large capacities, where we'll probably need to be drawing down as a species somewhere between 2 and 6 gigatons of CO2 by 2100 in order to make it, and in order to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so the ones that we're interested in are ones that are permanent and that are secure. And so the difference between your traditional ways that people talk about carbon capture, which is more here, the things like afforestation and soil carbon sequestration, those are not necessarily measurable or secure or permanent or verifiable. Those are important for the ecology of Earth, but trees are temporary carbon capture mechanisms. Once the tree dies, it's going to re-release whatever CO2 it had stored from the bark and the leaves back into the atmosphere. And so when you have things like wildfires that happen, that's a big problem. And then as you move across this, you get to more secure and more permanent things. And obviously, everyone will need to do all of these. But for us, we're kind of exclusively focused right now on ones that are more in the 100,000 year range of possibility. So those are things like carbon capture for, turning CO2 into rocks, injecting it into rocks, storing it underground in old empty oil reserves and that kind of thing. All of the different methods that are coming out now that are very exciting and are very early are things that we would love to test for what we're doing for Fly. And ideally the approach is some type of portfolio approach where we are thinking about the traditional methods where people talk about carbon capture, but that market is a little suspicious to me, given that you're sort of paying people not to cut down trees. That doesn't really feel like what we're thinking about, where we want to be able to say, you know, this is the place where we stored the carbon that we emitted and a bunch more. And so moving from just not doing harm, which I think is a reasonable thing, but if humans weren't where we are, but moving to a place where we can say that as humans, we're actually trying to be better for the environment than we are worse for it. And this is a picture of my manager, Marion, who is the CEO of Burning Man, and Chip Conley, who I showed you a picture of earlier, and this woman named Katiana, who was part of the Fly acquisition. And I showed this presentation internally and tried to defer questions to them, but they are not here today. So I'm happy to take your questions. And then I also thought I could talk through some more specific stuff around sustainability if you all wanted after that.
Oh, awesome. Matt, can you hear me? I think
yes.
So. Great, thank you. What a mystical sight, I love it. So we have at least one question from Pablo. I'm gonna start with a question of my own though, if I could be so bold. When you talk about regenerative, which you're right is maybe a poorly defined term, I'm curious how you guys think about what that term means and if you have any KPIs or metrics or data points you're trying to collect to help measure that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that we've talked about is we want to do, the first one we could imagine doing is planting a whole bunch of trees that fly. And that's something we've talked about for doing for next year. I think that this is where we want to involve the community, where Burning Man has all kinds of people who have expertise in this. And now that we've tried to set a goalpost for saying that we want to be able to say that, now we've been trying to back into it. And so we have a roadmap around this that's in a draft form, and we have draft roadmaps that have draft methodology ideas for each of the ideas now, because we put the roadmap out a year ago with the idea being that we would figure out a lot of this stuff along the way. And so the core idea is to just get to a point where we can say it's better for for Burning Man to exist than not exist. I consider that to be the most nebulous one, but also from a human perspective, it's also probably the most important, given how much more holistic it is. And so, not that it will just be like I know it when I see it thing, because we obviously want to produce a methodology for it, but we aren't yet in a place where we've gotten that specific around it. The other ones, for sure, we are closing in on methods around them, but that one, as you have pointed out, is very difficult to measure.
Cool. Okay, so going back to the land art generator initiative, question was, what are some do you have any examples yet of submissions, and what are the types of beneficial high impact infrastructure that the ranch and the Gerlach residents are hoping for?
I just put a link for our design challenge in there. The people's proposals are still coming together around this one. We've had discussions with people who want to use direct use solar for being able to power things like the banya. We've had people who've talked about doing gardening projects out there, doing greenhouse projects out there. One of the longer term impacts that I could imagine Fly having that would be really beneficial would be to provide fresh food out there, because it really is a desert and a food desert. So being able to have fresh grown foods out there would be amazing for people. Being able to do waste management and would be really useful for locals out there too, because it's just, we send everything to the dump out there. So one of the things that I've hoped that we would come out of this would be, I know that incineration and combustion are extremely complex, but there's a company called Sierra Energy that I've been watching that I really like their method for waste management and capture. One of the dream jobs I've had if I didn't have this job would be to drive around the US and excavate some of the 3,000 plus active landfills and figure out better ways of managing that waste. That's a hopeful next career path for me, but I think that having better waste management, having people have talked about doing direct water capture, where these huge nets that people will put up that behave kind of like insects in the desert. If you've seen that Planet Earth with the beetle that like pops up and catches water droplets and then drinks them when it flows down, that's an element of nature that we can replicate because there is water in the air out there. And so something like 3 trillion gallons of capturable water in the atmosphere. And so when we cart in water from everywhere and bring it in plastic containers, we're not really in tune with our local resources that are already available for us. I've we haven't had the formal proposal process hasn't closed yet, but those have been some of the conversations I've had with different teams about things they're considering submitting.
Cool. Great. Have there been requests to institute a limit on the number of people who come from Burning Man?
You mean to fly or to Burning Man as an event?
I assume it's about Burning Man as an event, but you could answer it in either way.
I mean,
it's asking for the environmental impact side of it. Like, is the limit because of the environmental impact, not necessarily for any other reason? So specify the question to that.
I mean, I think that, for the event, that's not necessarily my piece of the pie. I can speculate about things. And, everything, I think, we're having discussions around how we will actually achieve the goals in the roadmap. They are very ambitious. So I think that over the next 10 years, we'll have to figure out what kinds of trade-offs that we're willing to make. I think one of the challenging and fascinating things about working at Burning Man is it's not a traditional hierarchy. Decision-making doesn't happen in the ways that I've experienced at organizations before. It's more of like, once enough people think that something is a good idea, that's what we do. We don't really have metrics. We don't really have goals. We kind of flow culturally in the direction that the most people think that we should flow in. And so there have been just, anything that you could ask about have there been discussions about doing X at Burning Man or for Fly? The answer is likely yes. How far along have those gotten and who are the players in there is what is the relevant part of that, then continuing that discussion.
So I guess I'm going to ask a follow-up to that. Culturally, if you're trying to set a 10-year plan inside of that kind of decision-making environment, how does that work?
Maybe this would be a good transition to show you our 2020 update.
Okay, and there's a related question to that, maybe as part of your 2020 update, which is how has the pandemic and the inability to gather at Burning Man this year impacted the conversation around the sustainability plan?
Yeah, definitely. I think that in many ways, we've been able to do a lot more planning than we would have been able to do otherwise. Event production is all consuming when it happens in a way that nothing I've ever experienced before is. And so we've had this issue where we really start building Burning Man in March, and we aren't done with it until November. Many people just go out for a week or a couple days, but we have hundreds of people who are out there starting in May every year who are building the city and survey flags and all that stuff. And that's one of the coolest parts for me about my job is getting to see it all pop up and go from being empty to having 70,000 people and 1,300 theme camps and 518 art cars and 382 art pieces, all this stuff that comes out there. But this year we've really been able to take some time to solidify some of our plans and to think about what sustainability should and could look like because we've had more time. And I think that has informed a lot of the discussions. Then the safety piece, I think, of course we talk about it. I think that it's the most complex thing for us as an event that is inherently about deconstructing barriers between people and letting people find closeness and find connection with people. I think there's people we've talked to and who I've talked to around contact tracing and testing kits and vaccines and how all of that stuff would come into play for next year and for gatherings that we're having. And so that's stuff that we're interested in learning more about and working with scientists on and being really responsible stewards and taking account of what we can do and what's viable. But I think that overall, the pause year for Burning Man actually really accelerated some of our planning where we have people who otherwise would have had to work on the event production side who've been able to spend a lot of time thinking about how to make changes. And we've started buying up some solar trailers and making plans for solar infrastructure and how that would work. Because one of the things we've talked about doing in the roadmap is putting in a 20 megawatt solar array on the edge of Gerlach. And that's really complex, it turns out. So we've been able to spend some time planning because as a event that has previously been entirely temporary, moving into the space of planning permanent infrastructure is different for us. And it's really fun and it's a different challenge, when you think about how do you make something that doesn't just last a week, but that lasts a couple generations. And so from the fly perspective, I think we were always sort of moving slowly anyways. And so I think we'll be able to get back to a reasonable cadence next year, because we've always had enough space and distance. I think that for the overall picture for Burning Man, a lot of that will depend on everything else that's going on.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on this maybe with the solar array, but you know, a lot of people come to Burning Man, and you talked about these like longer range carbon capture strategies, which probably haven't even been invented yet. But I guess what are the questions, are there currently carbon capture strategies that are being enacted by Burning Man? Or I guess I'll elaborate it to, are there any specific proposals or topics that you get excited about in that regard, either for Burning Man or for the ranch?
Yeah, we have a couple conversations going with different organizations. One of the organizations I really like is a group called Climeworks, and Climeworks does their own offsets, and Stripe actually was kind of one of the first companies to take the plunge into doing direct air capture projects, and they purchased credits from Climeworks, and then we have a proposal from Climeworks that we've been evaluating in discussions with them, and then are in early stages of talking through it with other groups. And then one of the hopes that I have for what comes out of the design challenge would be that we would be able to build carbon capture projects on site at Fly. And so we've been in some discussions with different scientists about how to do either direct air capture or alkalization for being able to do storage there. It may or may not be the best thing. You know, I think that all of the needs of carbon capture and what works in different places is very different. You know, some places it's going to work really well to do storage in, you know, underground water reservoirs or empty oil fields, or to inject it in volcanic rocks and stick it underground. And so for us, you know, that's part of why the scientists gatherings with us has been so important, because no one had really studied the property that we were on in depth until the scientists came out and told us. And so now we're trying to kind of inform the discussions with the scientists around that. But yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I get really excited about the fact that you can turn CO2 into rocks and concrete and all these other things to be able to store it in a way that's permanent, where that's permanent and verifiable. You know, if you can build some rocks out of CO2 and put them underground, I can measure that. I know it's going to stay there. I'm not worried about it going away. So that's like, for me, that's the one I get most excited about.
Cool. Well, I'm going to take the privilege of the last question, given that I'm the only one that can unmute myself. But you spent a lot of time in tech, and now you spend a lot of time alone in the Burning Man environment. So for those of us that are still working in tech or working in sustainability, any lessons you've learned from a whole lifestyle change that we should adopt in our careers or our lifestyles? I guess you have a very unique lens on the alternative perspective. So I'm curious if there's any takeaways we should learn from you.
I mean, I think that the most important thing for me in staying sane has been my yoga and sitting practices. So I do podcasts from Yoga to the People a couple times a week, and they have Spotify. I mean, and I could have talked about this question the whole time if we wanted to, because it has been very difficult. But yeah, so I do an hour podcast once a week, or a number of times a week, from Yoga to the People, and then I sit on a cushion and stare at the wall for 30 minutes a day and try and come to terms with my place in the universe, and read a little selection from a Zen book that I have called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. But I think that, you know, just taking time to really do something that's not work and turn my screen off. I will also make a plug, which may be impossible for many of you. This is my phone. I have used a flip phone forever. And I think that smartphones really, really fuck with your attention span. And I don't have to tell you that, but I had one for 2 weeks when I worked at Facebook, and I felt like I had lost my brain. And then I also use a Google Chrome extension called Kill Newsfeed that I'm a huge proponent of, that made it, when I left Facebook, I almost deleted my Facebook. But then I found this Chrome extension, and then I don't really use social media otherwise, and that actually turns off your newsfeed on Facebook. And so I don't have a newsfeed. I haven't seen it in 8 years. And so I think that minimizing that input has been really useful for me and having direct contact with people. And then I quit coffee a while ago, and I really recommend that.
That last
So
one
that's
is the hardest piece of advice of all of them.
the-
Well, great, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. We do snaps at my company, so thank you.
Thank you.
For everyone else, what we're going to do is we're going to give folks a minute or two to, let me stop recording actually. Thank you. If I could do that.